For the first time in over a decade, we're having an Australian Grand Prix without Daniel Ricciardo, and something about that just doesn't feel right. He might not have always been the fastest driver on the grid, but he was always the star of the show in his own way. His exit from McLaren was disappointing, but not too surprising. Fortunately, things are looking positive for his return. So on the weekend of his home race, we thought we should talk about how he's going to make it back to Formula 1, and who sounds really eager to get him on their team. An Australian Grand Prix without Daniel Ricciardo driving just isn't the same. Daniel is still there and his fans still cheer his name, but on race day he will be missed. Oscar Piastri would be the fans' new favourite in normal circumstances, but there is another driver who's looking even more like an Aussie. Valtteri Bottas has fully embraced the bogan lifestyle this year and has called the Australian Grand Prix his home race as well. Oscar might be the only Aussie on the grid now, but it's Bottas who's the fans' favourite in Melbourne this year. But you aren't here to hear me describe Bottas's luscious mullet, you're here to find out where Daniel Ricciardo might be driving next year. So let's talk about that instead. Ricciardo's career has been pretty well documented by this point. We all know the battle with Max at Red Bull, the positive but not quite competitive enough stint at Renault, and then the terrible choice to join a McLaren team in freefall. His form at McLaren wasn't great, and there's only so much blame you can put on the car considering how Lando Norris performed. McLaren ended up deciding that Daniel needed replacing. They saw something in Oscar Piastri that they really liked and decided he was worth the cost of paying off Daniel's contract. Perhaps they should have been more worried about the car than who was driving it, but it's too late for that now. The first bit of good news for Ricciardo is that thanks to McLaren sacking him, he'll earn more money this year from Formula 1 than he has at any other point in his career. That's right, despite the fact he isn't actually driving a car, he'll earn his largest ever salary. Ricciardo's combined package from McLaren, who had to pay his contract to get him to leave, and Red Bull for 2023 will be $24.3 million. The majority of the money, a reported $22.2 million, will come from McLaren Racing as a severance pay for terminating his driving contract a year early. The rest of his salary for the coming year, another estimated $2.1 million, will be paid by Red Bull Racing as he becomes the team's third driver and a Red Bull ambassador. Not bad for what is basically a year-long holiday for him. Not that Daniel is spending his time relaxing on Bondi Beach. He's using his year off to get himself into the best possible shape to make a return to Formula 1 in 2024. The signs are pointing towards getting back on the grid, Ricciardo said on Thursday ahead of the Australian Grand Prix in Melbourne. I feel like that's currently where I'm tracking, at least in my head. I've even put myself in scenarios now where I'm like, if I got back on the grid tomorrow, what would I do differently? You just don't have the chance when you're in it. But I also think that everything happens for a reason. Having the chance to step back and just review everything from afar, and with the luxury of time as well, not to be forced to make a decision or rush anything. I feel that if I'm to get back on the grid, I honestly believe I'll be a better version of myself. A more mature, experienced, complete version. Before the announcement that McLaren were dropping Ricciardo at the end of 2022, Daniel looked to be a tired and beaten down version of himself. Things at McLaren clearly weren't working out. It was his worst season since he joined Red Bull all the way back in 2014, but there had been signs that this was coming before that. 2021 wasn't a great year for Daniel either. I know he won a Grand Prix, but if you exclude that shocking result, he had a tough time. He had been struggling for consistency, and mentally, Daniel was struggling. There's nothing wrong with that. Professional sport is a grind that consumes your entire life. Burnout is a real problem that happens to athletes across the world. It's surprising more Formula 1 drivers don't suffer from it. Being jet-lagged for 20 plus weeks a year must be brutal. Daniel needed the year off, and honestly, it's probably a good thing he didn't find a seat for this year. He needed a break. It's only taken a small break for the desire to race in F1 to start growing though. Ricciardo says he's not looking to rebuild his career from the back of the grid. I want to be back with a top team, and a team where I have that confidence back and my mojo, he said. To go back and to maybe put myself in any seat that's fighting at best for like a top 10, I don't think it's going to bring the best out of me. I see myself, at least in my head, wanting to be back on the grid. But there's still some terms and conditions, so to speak. It's not at all costs. As great as it would be to see Daniel back at a top team, his options might be a little too limited for that. There are 10 teams on the grid at the moment. McLaren definitely aren't going to take him back, so that leaves 9 other prospective employees. Then there are the teams that won't have an open seat. That's Red Bull, Ferrari, Aston Martin and Alpine. Obviously, there are loads of things that could happen which could see him take a seat on Red Bull or Ferrari. Aston Martin aren't getting rid of Alonso or Stroll anytime soon, and unless things go really wrong at Alpine this year, Gasly and Ocon are an incredibly marketable French duo on a French team. Their seats are safe. The Max versus Checo thing could explode this season, and Daniel might find himself replacing Perez. Though Nick de Vries is unproven at the moment, he would probably be Christian Horner's preferred option in the long term. The good news for Ricciardo is that his boss believes Daniel has rediscovered what's required in order to be a top-tier F1 driver. He's in good shape, he kept himself fit and well, he's training hard and he's ready to go given the chance, said Horner. I'd say he'd be about 10 minutes away from being ready. When you drive a car that has its limitations, you adapt to try and extract the maximum amount out of that car. It was clear that when he came back, he'd picked up some habits that we didn't recognise as the Daniel that had left us. We're certainly seeing him getting back to being far more reminiscent of the Daniel we knew. It's not a promise of a contract, but if something does happen to either Red Bull driver, Daniel is ready. It is a great sales pitch for the Aussie though. Most teams would find it hard to look past Daniel driving like he did at Red Bull. So what about Ferrari then? Any kind of movement at Ferrari probably depends on what happens at Mercedes, which we'll get to shortly. If a seat did come free at Ferrari, would they really go for Ricciardo though? He isn't exactly Ferrari material. They prefer an up-and-coming talent in their perpetual search for someone to fill the hole that Michael Schumacher left in the team. That leaves us with the 5 teams with spaces, and one of them has already said they'll speak with him about a space. Can you guess who? The options are Mercedes, Alfa Romeo, Haas, Williams and Alpha Tauri. Only one of those teams could be described as the top team that Daniel wants to join, and that is Mercedes. I know some of you don't like to talk about it, but Hamilton hasn't signed a new contract with Mercedes yet. The two parties have been talking about how they will sign for a year now, and nothing has happened. Would Mercedes give Ricciardo the nod over Mick Schumacher though? My personal opinion is that Mick didn't do enough at Haas to show he could grow into a regular podium finisher. Mercedes might think differently, but the regular driver errors he made that cost Haas millions of dollars every year are hard to look past. That money will come out of Mercedes' development budget, which they desperately need to be making the most of at the moment. So while Daniel might be the better choice between the two if Hamilton doesn't sign a new contract, I don't think it will happen disappointingly. He won't want to go to AlphaTauri, so let's cross that off the list straight away. What about Williams then? They are a team on the up, especially now James Vowles is at the helm. Alex Albon's contract is up at the end of the year, but surely he'll do enough to earn a new contract. It's too soon to make a call on Logan Sargent, but that might be an option. Definitely not a top team, barely fighting for top 10s at the moment, and probably don't have the budget for Ricciardo either, so that's a no from me. That leaves Alfa Romeo and Haas. Audi taking over Alfa Romeo in 2026 messes with things here. Do they want a German driver in the seat? Do they want an experienced driver to help test the new car? We just don't know, but they already have Bottas who isn't out of contract this year. Joe would be the one to go if he can't continue to grow, and Mick Schumacher is the favourite to replace him if he leaves. So that leaves the one team that has actually said they want to talk to Daniel. The team that will always have a place in my heart, Haas. Fielding the oldest tandem on the grid this year with Kevin Magnussen and Nico Hülkenberg. Both contracts are up after this season, and the American team has stated they prefer experienced hands on their wheels. Drive to Survive viewers will recall Magnussen asking Haas team principal Gunther Steiner whether they could sign Ricciardo after he left McLaren. In the most perfect Gunther Steiner way, he dismissed the idea. We can't afford him, Kevin. He wants 10 effing million, minimum. Despite that, after a year out of the sport and a reality check, Daniel might lower his price and Gunther is open to signing the Aussie. It's a bit early to speak about a driver change already for next year, so let's see what we're doing with these drivers first, the Haas boss said when asked whether his team would pursue Ricciardo for 2024. For sure, at some point maybe I'll speak with him, but I cannot promise anything. The good news for Daniel is that that's definitely not a no. Hülkenberg could definitely turn out to be a disappointment, giving Ricciardo an easy route back to the sport if he can survive on less than $10 million a year. Despite Magnussen's contract being up at the end of the season, I don't see him going anywhere, but the Hulk seat is far from safe. K-Mag and Ricciardo driving for Haas in 2024? Now that would be something to see. Do you think Daniel will make it back to the grid? If he does, will he be at Haas? Could he be Hamilton's replacement? Let us know your predictions in the comments down below. Enjoy the Australian Grand Prix, and we'll speak to you next week with all the reaction to the race. Drive safe and bye for now.